In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the best camera settings you can use to get the most out of your current gear. I want to talk about the exposure triangle. Now, these are the basic settings that make up how much light gets into a photograph to make a proper exposure. So the three things that affect the exposure triangle are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, aperture is the opening on the lens. So if you use a lower f-stop number like f1.8 or f4, this is going to be a bigger opening in the lens. And if you use a higher number like f16 or f22, it's going to be a smaller hole in the lens and let in less light. Now, using a more wide open aperture is usually more pleasing for portraits because it creates that sort of bokeh effect, where your subject is in focus in the front of the frame and everything else in the back sort of blurs out. So this is what I most commonly do for my portraits. I will shoot at, say, f1.8 or f2, f4 to try to get that sort of bokeh in my portraits. Now, depending on what lens you have, the aperture might not open up as wide as 1.8, but if you do have a lens that's at f1.8, I recommend opening up to wide open. It's important to do this because when you create that sort of bokeh, it takes out a lot of the distracting elements in the background. So say if you have trash cans or trees or people in the background, the more you blur those elements out, the better you can put your subject as the center of attention in your photographs, which is usually what you want to do with portraits. So if you're shooting in the daytime and you're opening up the aperture all the way, you're going to have to compensate a lot with the shutter speed. Now on my camera, the shutter speed goes up to 1/4000th of a second, and on most modern DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, you can do the same. So I recommend shooting with settings something like f1.8, 1/4000th of a second shutter speed, and ISO 100. Now for me, I like to keep the ISO as low as possible. As you increase the ISO, it'll increase the brightness of your image, but it will also increase the amount of grain that's in your image. Now obviously, if you're shooting at night and you don't want to use flash, you will have to increase your ISO to get a better exposure, but I usually try to keep my ISO under 800. And at those levels, at least on my camera, it's not as noticeable the amount of grain you get in the photographs. Now when you start going above ISO 800, it does get more significantly grainy, and that can be problematic. But generally, if you're shooting in the daytime or if you're shooting around golden hour or in the early evening, then you can be able to shoot around ISO 100 to ISO 400 and get good exposures with that. So generally, on most portraits I shoot, let's say it's a sunny day, I might shoot at f1.8 with 1/4000th of a second shutter speed and ISO 100. And that's the settings I'll use for most of my daytime portraits. Now, as we get towards golden hour, I will make the shutter speed a bit slower, so I might be shooting at 1/1000th of a second or 1/500th of a second, or if it's getting particularly dark, I might go down to something like 1/60th of a second. Now, I typically don't like to go below 1/60th of a second when I'm shooting portraits. And the main reason for this is that if the subject moves at all, it might create some blur in your image. So say you're shooting and they happen to move their hand, you might have like that sort of blurry, wavy hand if you're shooting at a 60th of a second. But if you're shooting at, say, 100th of a second or 1/125th or above faster shutter speeds, you're probably going to stop the motion. And even if someone's sort of mid-motion, if you're shooting at, say, 1/250th of a second, even if they're moving their hand particularly quickly, you're probably going to be able to capture that and freeze that motion. Now obviously you can compensate for this by interacting with your model a bit more and having them not move around as much in between taking photos, but in general, as people are moving through different poses, you're going to have that happening, so it's important to have a faster shutter speed when you can. Now again, a lot of this is going to be trial and error. You're going to learn through experience what camera settings work best for you. I recommend testing out manual mode and trying some of these different settings to get the best results with them. Now I will include some sample camera settings in the notes for this lesson that you can use in different scenarios such as harsh sunlight, early golden hour, and nighttime settings. Now these settings are mostly going to be for manual mode, where you're going to be able to control all three of the exposure triangle settings, which is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, if you're not completely comfortable with starting in manual mode, then just try aperture priority mode. What aperture priority mode does is you set the aperture and the ISO, which you'll usually keep stable, and then the camera will adjust the shutter speed based on what you need to get a proper exposure. Now, I shot with Aperture priority mode for a lot of my early portrait shoots, but a few months in I decided to switch into manual mode and try to get the most out of my camera settings as I learned them better. But Aperture priority mode can be a very good mode to use as an intermediary to getting into manual mode, and you'll get to learn a little bit more about how each element of the exposure triangle affects each other. Hey yo, if you like this video, please be sure to hit that subscribe button to stay in touch with all the awesome portrait photography tutorials I'm putting out. Also, you can click on the links on the screen to watch another video. Boom, dude.